Hello everyone, it's George from Ireland. So here I'm at Eton and I'm going to speak about Percy Bysshe Shelley and his time at Eton because it's the bicentennial of his death. Not today, but this year. And behind me is the headmaster's house. So I don't want to go into the background of Eton, I talked about that in other videos. So Shelley came here at the age of 12. He was born in 1792 in Horsham, Sussex, and I shan't say too much more about his family background. He's from an upper class family. His grandfather had become a baronet. His father, Timothy Shelley, was a Whig MP. Percy was the eldest of 9 children, 7 of whom lived to adulthood. So Percy had already been schooled at a boarding school called Sion House, which was just west of London in those days. So he'd already got the better of ancient Greek accidents and so on, and Latin grammar. He knew his declensions, gerunds and all that. So he was fortunate to be exposed to a few other languages when he was at his maximum neuroplasticity. And he astounded his schoolmasters with his extraordinary verbal felicity and aptitude for writing in English as well as in other languages. So then he came to this school by the River Thames, and it was there somewhere for the mass production of MPs, governors general and so forth. So it was the upper class school at the time, had about 400 boys. So proportionally to the population that we had, it was bigger than it is today. Anyway, certainly the foremost school in the British Empire at the time. And here we are, hard by the River Thames. Windsor Castle is the other side, where the founder of the school was born, Henry VI, and indeed is buried. So the Thames was what occupied a lot of Shelley's time, because summer lessons were optional, and he would take a little boat and he would go rowing out to the Eats along the river. But he was a social outcast. He was a pariah because he was very forthright in proclaiming himself to be a disbeliever in all religion. And he was known as Shelly the Atheist and Mad Shelley. He was often surrounded by the others and mercilessly mocked and his books torn out of his hands and so on, and he would start wailing in his very high-pitched voice. They said that he was crazy, and actually they may have had something, there may have been something in that, because he appeared to be perhaps autistic because he was hyperlexic, and his extraordinary aptitude in some areas was balanced by a deficiency in others. I mean, you might have said he was socially retarded, or was it just morally courageous because he's unwilling to bow down and conform. And remember that being an atheist then was regarded as absolutely scandalous, and he was never protected by the schoolmasters, beaks as they used to call them. So pastoral care was in its infancy back then. Perhaps they thought that he deserved what he got being an infidel. So he was certainly quick at his books, and though he was very rebellious on certain matters, he was not captious in class. Remember, you could be birched on the slightest pretext just for getting the answer wrong when it came to a misconstrual of something from Greek or Latin. And remember, classics composed the great bulk of the curriculum in those days, and there'd be many boys taught by the lower master in lower school or the headmaster in upper school. I don't know which house he was in, but he also had a tutor. So everybody had to have a tutor as well as a housemaster to give them some extra lessons in what they were doing. Sorry, not housemaster. There were a few dominies, as in male dames. Usually dames as middle-aged women ran boarding houses, and you had to live in one of those. Okay, housemasters as such only came in later in the 19th century. So sports were going on, and they were entirely optional, and they were completely organised by the boys. Remember, sports weren't formalised. The rules of football hadn't been written down. So Eton had his own game. The footballers played upon the field at Eton, or the field game as they called it. And they often used to play here, what's known as College Field. There's the wall behind, and the wall game was being played in Shelley's time, been played for a few decades beforehand. There's no record that he ever played it, so he showed complete indifference to sports. And then as now, if you're an outstanding athlete, then you have kudos amongst your schoolfellows. But Shelley didn't want to play with a bag of wind at all. So he was left alone in his own thoughts a lot of the time. He went over to Poet's Walk. I've walked upon that spit of land in that backwater of the Thames and shown you where he would go to muse, be alone with his thoughts. He's a real cloud dweller, and perhaps composing his poems in his head. But there's hardly even any juvenilia from this time. It's really only after he left Eton that he put quill to paper. that he got to know the king's physician at Windsor, Dr. Lind. And it was a curious irony that Dr. Lind took him under his wing and not any of the teachers at Eton, because Lind's main patient was obviously Shelley's nemesis, King George II, and Shelley he fulminated against everything. Well, the egregious episcopacy, as well as the moronic monarch George II, who was stricken with porphyria, who was mentally ill, a bit like Shelley. So that's more of the main school buildings, the headmaster's office and such like, the Eton List office. But this would all have existed at the time. Some of the buildings I'll pass later would not have existed at the time. So he was bitterly unhappy here, but he doesn't appear to have wished to leave. He certainly got a sound education, more than a grounding in the classics, and he stayed here until the age of 18. So he doesn't seem to have a single friend. Was really just alone with his books, his reveries, and so on. But that social isolation, I suppose, had made him concentrate even more on ameliorating his education. He was autodidactic in some sense, because he was then fathoming the depths of philosophy and realizing there were people like Lucretius that had been disbelievers even in the remotest times, and he thought that Christianity was really a myth. There were so many provable contradictions or illogicalities in Christian doctrine, so he didn't believe revealed religion at all, which took extraordinary self-assurance and intellectual confidence to do that, given that just about every erudite person fervently believed. And it was no coincidence, surely, that this was good for their emolument, because if you professed a zealous Christian faith, then yes, you could get preferment in church and state, and a very comfortable berth. Bear in mind that almost all the teachers back then were ordained in the Church of England. And you had to be a communicant of the Church of England to be in most professions. These buildings behind me did not exist until the mid-19th century, so well after Shelley's death. So we're now in Westlands Yard, named after an earlier lower master of Eton as a sort of deputy headmaster. So anyway, Shelley would have walked through here. I'm sure he walked through that arch, and that's the thing. I'm seeing the things that he's seen and curiously communing with him. And who else am I communing with? Just think George Orwell. He saw some of the buildings that I've seen, so I've coincided with them spatially but not temporally, or they must have walked across this path, this exact path, and I must have crossed the line that they walked across, and I must have stepped on a bit of the stone that they've stepped on, and so on. So how I wish I could meet with these people, but I can't. But I can strangely communicate with them, have some sort of contact, and that's very gratifying to me. Anyway, Shelley went down when he was 18, and at the age of 17 he published Zastrozzi, which is a Gothic horror novel set in Italy about some sort of chase through the night and assassins and so on. It's really got pace, but it's perhaps a bit jejune. As one might expect for someone that age, he made a tidy profit in it, which he blew on a dinner for himself, and they went up to University College, Oxford. So I'm not quite sure he went to one of those less distinguished colleges, well, other than the fact that his father had attended it. Because I know there is 39 colleges in Oxford these days, about 20 at the time, and rather few people. So he was known to the whole school, Shelley, because he was such an odd bod and horrendously bullied. So he later on lived not very far away, just outside Egham in a cottage. But so far as I know, he never revisited Eton, and I can't blame him, because he was immiserated here. But he felt the deepest sympathy for the proletariat, plebes, hoi polloi, and many of their children would have died early of malnutrition. As he wrote later, they would moan for hunger and weep for cold. Or was it the other way around? But a lot of his schoolfellows would not have felt the least empathy for such people and say, well, this is the natural and settled order of things, and this is the way it's got to be. Remember, the Napoleonic Wars were in full swing, so radicalism was regarded as treasonous if you're trying to peacefully reform the system. And Shelley believed that there needed to be abolition of the monarchy, that hereditary titles ought to be done away with, and so forth. But he stopped short of demanding full democracy, asking that every man be allowed to have a vote. That was just a bit too much for him. Though he did say there ought to be greater rights for women, he didn't advocate full equality. One of the few issues he doesn't seem to remotely engage with homosexuality. So this is Upper School, which stood at the time when Shelley was here. Well, the higher room is Upper School, the various offices down there, although actually a lot of it's rebuilt. What I was going to say, you see that drain pipe? Everything this side of the drain pipe was rebuilt after the Second World War because a bomb fell there and destroyed it. you'll see the stone is quite different on the other side of the drain pipe. Anyway, so that's just a little bit about Shelley at Eton. Toodaloo.